this story is now like low carb legend, lore, mythery, or whatever. Like, I, tell us about coming into the low carbohydrate space for the first time, and what did you want to communicate with people that very first time you got on stage?
Well, for sure, I wanted to, for a little extra context, the very first conference that I'd ever gone was exactly 1 year earlier, and it was also Jeffrey Gerber's conference, and it was Low Carb Vail at that time. First time the conference was ever held. Um, Jeff will concede a bit of this was also sort of an excuse to have skiing so he could get like,
Of course it
you know,
was.
fellow buddies together and they could be like, oh, and it's a conference and there's CME. Oh, and by the way, we have like 2 hour breaks for outdoor activities of who knows what kind that happen to be in Vail, right?
Interesting.
And when I went there, this was about 3 months in after I'd gotten my blood work and after I had had 8 blood tests where I was showing the inversion pattern. I don't know if you had seen my earlier talks where I'm talking about that. And I'm like, this is it. I'm going to go to this low carb Vail conference in 2016. And I had my laptop. And this is part of the lore is I'm wandering around with my laptop and I'm looking like a crazy maniac engineer guy who's like, you got to see this. You got to see this. Let me explain, blah, blah, blah. And they did not know how to digest what it was that I was saying. But I kept talking to all the folks, including Jeff, and eventually Jeff said, and here's an interesting fun fact to know and tell. On that weekend of low carb Breckenridge 2017, there was also another conference I had originally intended to go to, and it was the National Lipid Association, the major organization that's specifically connected to the science of lipids, which seemed more appropriate for me to bring my data to, at least in my mind at that time, that that would be a place where there'd be a lot greater receptivity. And by that time, I hadn't just had the 8 blood tests, I had 29, the 29 blood tests, and I had the energy model, the beginnings of the energy model in hand. And I thought maybe if I just get there, I'll find somebody who will take me on that. Jeff goes, don't bother going to that conference. Come to our conference. I'll give you a slot, toward the end on a Sunday. And yes, when I got there, I wanted to really drive home the point that I don't think can be stated strongly enough, which is that it's not just that that lipid levels move up and down quickly in our body. It's that we just never had this situation before, pretty much since we started doing blood work on lipids, where there was a number of people who would intentionally seek to be powered by fat who were also metabolically healthy. So those two things together. Like Atkins existed before, but Atkins was typically adopted by people who were metabolically challenged. They were like really overweight and they were willing to forego the doctor's advice on saturated fat. But if you were a health nut in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, if you were running, if you were listening to the advice of skip the steak and have a salad, right? And if you're wanting to run, what do you want to do? You want to top off your glycogen stores. You want to do the pasta party with everybody else. Carbs were the way. And saturated fat was, for anybody who just didn't care that much about their health. So here we have the rise of keto right about the time that I'm coming in. And now, as I started writing cholesterol code, I'm sharing my data, other people are sharing it with me. So it was a confluence of many different things that benefited this larger story. Uh, I I benefited from, for example, social media existing for people having this level of interest and for us connecting. But this phenotype, this rise of a group of people who didn't just have marginally higher LDL, but like me, suddenly, boom, we're in the top 1%. And it doesn't follow what we would have thought. Up until that point in time, we would have thought it'd be the person sitting at home, eating food and not getting anything done, not the most metabolically healthy, particularly the leanest folks. Why would they be getting the highest LDL? So when I went on that stage in 2017, I wanted to not just bring the data that I had, but I wanted to leave open some very provocative questions. I wanted to really tantalize people and get them interested in this journey with me to help figure this out. And yeah, at that time, the energy model made the most plausible sense. And much of it's still the case today. It's actually surprising how many of the pillars that I was kind of, building up at that time have kind of made it all the way to our published paper in 2022.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's surprising in a sense, but anything that's true becomes more and more and more true over time. And that certainly has made sense. It seems to tie up things and answer more questions and be really context specific for so many different things. And that definitely has been borne out over time. Maybe now would be a good time to talk a little bit more about the lipid energy model and the lean mass hyperresponder in particular, because we so far been talking about high cholesterol, high LDL cholesterol, but there's other parts of that phenotype that people need to understand and really appreciate. We're not just looking at one thing in isolation. We're looking at a system and a context, which is again why you're such an expert in this field with your engineering mind.
Yeah, yeah. So you hear the term metabolic health constantly, constantly, constantly in this space. But let's kind of break that out a little bit. So metabolism is the counterbalancing between anabolism, which is the building up of stuff, and catabolism, which is the breaking down of stuff. And if you've got good metabolic health, you're good at building stuff up, breaking it down, but in particular in the area of fuel, right? So if you're not going to be fueled as much by carbohydrates, in fact, if you're bringing your carbohydrates down enough, then your liver wisely goes, oh, my present stored glucose is low to the extent that I want to whip up the fat-based energy stores to be releasing at a more rapid rate. So glycogen stores in the liver get low enough. Kind of think of glycogen stores as like maybe the room in your refrigerator, but your fat stores are like 20 walk-in freezers, right? You've got plenty of storage there, but it it takes a little bit more thawing, if you will, right? There that has to be spun up. And your body's pretty quick. It's pretty quick to adapt in that the liver won't allow glycogen to get too low before it has reason enough to start this whole cascade that ultimately results in your fat cells releasing fat at a faster rate. Why? Well, the best way I could put it is your bloodstream is kind of like a buffet, and your body is running this buffet, and so your cells need energy on demand at all times. Well, if you've got less and less glucose being stocked on that buffet, you need to have more fat on that buffet instead, right? Okay, so now more is getting released into the bloodstream, and oxidative tissues can take more advantage of it, where they're not taking care of taking glucose, they can take fat instead. But on top of that, importantly, you need to replete, you need to refill at a faster rate. Those fat cells, those adipocytes, they need to get restored along with more fat fuel going to the oxidative tissues as well. And that's where the liver comes in again, because it's also picking up a lot of that fat that's coming out. It's packaging it onto something called VLDL, very low density lipoproteins. And so the lipid energy model, and here's the part where it starts to get controversial because there's a lot of debate on this part, is we're positing more of the fat's coming into the liver, it's taking up more fat, it's packaging and secreting more of these lipid-rich VLDL, but that's coupled with something else. It's coupled with a faster turnover of these VLDL. So they're barely getting out of the liver before hungry cells are rapidly depleting them of their triglyceride load. And because of that, you end up with both lower triglycerides because of the turnover, and these VLDL, as they're dropping off those lipids, they shrink and become smaller and become the more famous LDL. That explains the higher LDL cholesterol. The cholesterol ride shares with the triglycerides on these VLDL, and therefore you end up with more successive, not just LDL particles, but LDL cholesterol. Lastly is the third component, and it's an important one, but it's a little esoteric, which is the HDL. Why is the HDL cholesterol so high for people like myself and Nick Norwitz and many who are lean mass hyperresponders? Well, because part of that turnover is that as that VLDL is shrinking, it's shedding. It's not just that those lipids are coming off and into cells, but literally its surface components are starting to come apart because when things are getting smaller at that rate, they have to drop off those components. And there are fleets, there are many more HDL particles than there are ApoB lipoproteins in your bloodstream. And they're picking up those surface components, they're picking up the cholesterol esters, and they're forming and becoming larger. So a good way I like to describe it is these ApoB lipoproteins like VLDL, their job is to start large. They have all their cargo from the beginning. And their job is to start large and to get small. Conversely, HDL's job is to come into the bloodstream small and to get large. And it gets large from that turnover. So now let's bring it all the way back to metabolic health. What are the two things we look for that's low-hanging fruit to determine if somebody's metabolically healthy? We look at triglycerides and we look at HDL. So when triglycerides are high, what does that mean? It means poor metabolism because it means they're having trouble putting those triglycerides away. So you've got this fuel that's building up. The buffet line is, it's coming over. And what should be happening is it should be getting put away. So metabolism, in the simplest terms, is an ease of putting fuel away and bringing it back out again. But when it's not getting pulled away because there's a lack of turnover, that also means less that's going into the HDL pool, and therefore HDL is lower. And it flips if you're metabolically healthy. Triglycerides go down, the HDL goes up. So what's interesting about this, where the controversy is that it's very difficult for me, even with advanced lipidologists, to bring to their attention the idea that they're literally that the lipid energy model is positing a higher secretion rate of these VLDL, these triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, because from their perspective, it's static, that the turnover is the same, whether you're powered by fat or not. And we definitely arguing differently. I'm saying no, the turnover is faster because you are powered by fat. You do have greater turnover. And by the way, this is why it gets all the clues just kind of fall into place. One of my favorite examples is if I was trying to manufacture lean mass hyperresponders, I wouldn't just get people who are lean. I'd get people who run at a higher rate cardio wise, because your heart muscle cells, cardiomyocytes, they love triglycerides coming off of VLDL. It's because they're a lot of power. So they're a lot of ATP yield. A triglyceride is around 460 ATP, whereas a beta hydroxybutyrate is around 22, and a glucose molecule is around 34 to 36, something in that neighborhood. But a triglyceride is 3 fatty acids with a glycerol backbone. Average-ish is around 460. And a VLDL leaving the cell, guess how much it has on board? How many triglycerides it has on board?
I've heard you say this number before. What, 4,000 or something?
10,000. 10,000. So 10,000 times 460, you've got massive amounts of ATP yield. It makes total sense. And this is why I think it makes sense when they do things like they selectively delete lipoprotein lipase on rodents in rodent models. They have heart failure. They cannot compensate enough with non-triglyceride fuel, with non-ApoB lipoprotein delivered fuel. They need it because that turnover is so crucial.
Interesting. That is super well explained. We've had Dr. Adrian Sotomoto on our show several times as well, and he's explained kind of this next part and how you guys determined the cutoff, or how it was determined. It wasn't really determined by you. According to him, it was kind of a computer model that picked the cutoff, which was very interesting. When we're talking about lean mass hyperresponders, we're talking about these people where we see the greatest elevation in cholesterol with people that are also the leanest. You've kind of alluded to it already, but can you explain exactly that correlation, that part of the equation as far as a lean mass hyperresponder?
Yeah, well, and actually, just to finish on your point with Adrian, yeah, this was one of the most exciting things. Is my first go around in working with him was on the LMHR paper. And it was great because I was up front and have been this whole time that the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, those cut points were chosen by me, but from pattern recognition. It wasn't it wasn't that I just kind of went, I think it should just be these. No, it was from me seeing it enough times